Um, I don't know. I could just make something up. I guess in my mind, I see, an avuncular person who is quite tall, quite commanding, and sort of caring person.
Great. A man or a woman?
I'd originally thought a man, but when you started to prompt me about how I visualize that, I could easily see a woman in that role.
And this is a 5'3" Indian woman who's 27 years old. And welcome to everybody's listening filters, because while we were going through that, everybody was trying to visualize a doctor as well. And you all had a completely different image of what the doctor could be. And the next level of distraction is our own imagination. We anticipate in a story. We bring our historical heuristics and preferences to a conversation. We're not even conscious of it. So the second level of distraction is the story, whatever the dialogue is, and your experience around that and the background and the story you tell about the story around it. If somebody said to you, a beautiful beach holiday in Waikiki in Hawaii, everybody's got a perspective on what that looks like, but everybody will be listening through a slightly different perspective when it comes to that. So the two big barriers to listening are external distractions, typically electronic devices, but it could be visual as well if you're in a coffee shop or some place where there might be noise. And then internal distractions, the stories in your head about the story you're about to hear or the story you are hearing. They're the two biggest distractions our database tell us get in the way of their listening.
What I'm assuming that there are techniques that I can use to be an effective listener, and that your quest around deep learning is one of education, one of helping people understand those techniques.
Yeah, education's handy, but I'm a practitioner, so I really always want to get a result for somebody. So the three things that people say stick, the three things that help people make easy progress, the three things that people know straight away, if they do these three things, they're going to make progress straight away. Tip number one, switch off the devices. If you can't switch them off, switch them into flight mode. If you can't switch them into flight mode, switch the notifications off. There is a gradual scale you could go through to switch off the electronic distractions. Today, with video conferencing and COVID-19, there are more distractions than there were a year ago, and there are more distractions than there were a decade ago in terms of electronic things. I remember a visiting Microsoft vice president flew from Seattle to San Francisco and then to Sydney, Chris. And I was hosting 20 executives in a room in Sydney, and he did something quite profound. He'd traveled 24 hours. I was the first meeting. I'd introduced Peter to the room, and just as he was about to or supposed to speak, he stood up, walked away from the table. I was completely confused. He went over to his bag and put his cell phone there. Came back to the table and said, look, I'm really sorry. I've just traveled 24 hours. The most important thing I can do right now is give you my complete and undivided attention. And in that moment, 17 of the 20 execs did exactly the same thing. There was a rustling. People got up, put their cell phones in their bag.
Yeah.
And it was beautiful role modeling. But what it taught me was this phrase and the distinction between giving attention and paying attention. Giving attention feels like an act of curiosity and generosity. Paying attention feels like taxation. It feels like something you're required to do. And for all of us, when we switch off those devices, that's step number one. Step number two is make the choice about where your attention is, because remember, you'll get distracted internally. So tip number two is drink water. Drink water. The brain, less than 5% of body mass, yet it consumes 22% of blood sugars. Fastest way to get blood sugars to the brain? Water. Listening happens in the prefrontal cortex, the most modern part of the brain, and the part of the brain that's going to consume most of those blood sugars. So tip number two, drink water. And tip number three, just take 3 deep breaths. In through your nose, down to the bottom of your lungs, and then out through your mouth. That'll send a signal to the nervous system the parasympathetic nervous system, the part of our nervous system that tells us everything's okay for the next 10 minutes, the next half an hour, the next hour. It's okay. You don't need to go back into the most primitive part of the brain and worry that somebody's going to come and attack you or your idea. So in drinking water and breathing deeply and in switching off your devices, we know people's listening productivity triples straight away. Sounds really basic. You probably wanted some more fancy pants moves from me, Chris, but I think if most of us just stuck with the basics, we'd make so much more progress a lot faster. Listening is an attention game, and we need to give attention rather than pay attention.
It's really fascinating stuff. One of the things that I'd never thought about before is as I was prepping for this call, I was thinking, how can I be a better listener? Are there actions you can take if you're trying to communicate something to help people be better listeners to you?
You need to be able to speak to big picture, and you need to be able to speak to statistics. You need to be able to tell stories, and you need to have sequence. So people find speakers boring when they are only speaking to the left brain or the right brain. Meaning, if I'm somebody who enjoys a story and you don't give me a story, I'm not going to pay attention. I think you're pretty boring. And if all you do is give me stats, I'm also going to think you're pretty boring. And today, whether it's Peter's story or Dr. Lai's story or the 125-900 rule, and the brain is 5% of body mass and 22% of blood sugars, those things are firing up completely different parts of the brain for you who are listening right now. By the way, welcome back, because some of you are distracted right now because you might be cooking or running or doing whatever you're doing. The other thing you need to be aware of, I can speak at 125 words a minute, but you can listen at 400 words per minute. So you are neurologically programmed to be distracted. We have peripheral vision, but we also have peripheral hearing as well, Chris. So that's why we are distracted. And I always say I'm not a perfect listener. What I do better than everybody else, though, is I notice much faster when I'm distracted and come back into the conversation. So back to that question. This is a question I get asked a lot by speakers. I would go on stage immediately before, immediately after somebody who was talking on the topic of effective communication, and they would say to me, or at least the enlightened ones would anyway, Chris, they would say that question you've just asked me. And I always say, if you're able to speak to both parts of the brain, the person is able to listen, because it lets one part of the brain relax and another part fire up and another part relax and another part fire up. If you don't know the audience, always lead with the story and land with the stats. If you can follow that simple formula, you'll have an engaged audience.
Another thing that occurred to me when I was looking through your beautifully presented book, by the way, that you sent me ahead of this, was a quote that I love from Miles Davis. And Miles Davis, the jazz trumpeter, says, don't play what's there, play what's not there. Mm-hmm. And, that sort of creates a picture for me of how Miles Davis approaches music and uses spacing and gaps and silence to make beautiful music. It's kind of the idea of what's not there. You talk too about listening to what's not being said. Can you explain that concept?
Yeah, there's two elements to listening to what's there. That's what people haven't said already, and there's also listening completely to the silence. So I want to talk about silence first. If you've mastered switching off your devices, drink of water, 3 deep breaths, just practice staying with silence a little longer. In the West, we have this awkward relationship with silence. We call it the pregnant pause, the awkward silence, the deafening silence. Yet in the East and in high context cultures, the Maori, the Aboriginal, the Inuit communities, silence is a sign of authority. It's a sign of respect. It's a sign of wisdom. For many of us, if all we practiced was to go 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000 in our head, we would find that no, we don't have to say the next thing because the other person hasn't finished saying out aloud what they're thinking. Which brings us to the second part and back to the 125-900 rule. My head has got 900 words stuck in it, Chris. It's like a washing machine. Trying to wash clothes, it's agitated, it's sudsy, it's dirty. It feels like that idea is just bouncing around in the washing machine. The act of speaking is like the rinse cycle. It cleans the mind. It creates a neural pathway towards an idea that's very different when we think about it inside our own head. And in exploring what isn't said, they say the first 125 words, but the gold comes after that. Chris, I'm curious if you've ever heard anybody say these magical code words. And I'll do a bit of a setup. So somebody says, I'm dealing with this problem, and, they go on for a couple of minutes. And you can use 3 phrases really quickly at that point to get them to say the next 125 words. And the first phrase would be, tell me more. It's a really simple phrase. It's a really neutral phrase. And all of a sudden they will. Or you could say, and anything else. Or, and what else? And what else is easy to remember because it's an acronym called OR, AWE. It's an OR question. And it does get an awesome result. Michael Bungay Stanya is an absolute master of using and what else, the OR question. And then the last one is silence. But what happens when you ask those 3 questions every single time? Chris, tell me if you've ever heard these magic code words. People will take a deep breath in. They'll go, well, actually, Chris, what we should be talking about is, geez, Chris, now that I've thought about it a little longer, couldn't we just spend a bit more time over here? Well, Chris, actually, what we should be talking about is this. And it's in spending time in deep listening to what's not said. Why risk a big project just discussing 11% of the possibility when you could double that just by simply saying, tell me more? And you could double it again by saying, and what else? And you could double it again by just being silent. Too many of us are in a rush. And as a result, our projects run over time. We lose customer opportunities because somebody else listened a little bit better. Or worse still, great staff that we spend a lot of time recruiting, keeping, and nurturing in the organization leave before they want to because their manager hasn't listened to what they haven't said so far. So in exploring what's unsaid, this is the power and the potency. When I say deep listening impact beyond words, it's beyond the first set of words that people say that we really want to go. I was running a workshop. It was in our southern city, Melbourne, which is kind of a cross between Boston and San Francisco in a number of ways. It's got the history of Massachusetts, and it's got a beautiful river, not too dissimilar to Boston as well. And I was in this room facilitating 13 leaders in an organization, and they'd been growing really well for 3 years, 30% growth year on year on year. They were doing really, really well. And I'd asked the group, describe our organization as an animal. And they described their organization as an animal, and everybody described the organization as some kind of very fast bird, an osprey, an eagle, something that was very fast, could catch things and then move on. Yet there was one person who hadn't finished speaking. And it was 5 to 12. And the CEO was looking at me as if to say, I need food in my belly. I need food. We're supposed to have lunch at noon. And he looked at me and he tapped on the table and pointed to his watch. And I just nodded to him as if to say, yeah, relax. I know where this is going. You want to eat. But we hadn't heard from Eileen. Now, Eileen was a card-carrying member of the introvert community, a voice we don't normally hear from because they don't speak up. But rather than cold call on her and say, hey, Eileen, you haven't gone. It's your turn to speak. I just gestured with an open palm to her. I turned and looked in her general direction, but didn't look directly into her eyes. And she said, I thought it was obvious. And you could hear a pin drop in the room at this point, and I could feel at the back of my head, Chris, like X-ray vision, the CEO, in those comic strips, the laser beams hitting the back of my head and exploding. It's like, come on, why are we wasting time on this? And I just lowered my palm a little bit further and I extended